If-then statements form an important part of flowcharts, decision trees, computer programming, and other logic processes. We use them in our everyday life as well. If the fuel gauge says empty, then go buy petrol at the next service station you see. If the sauce is too thin, then put in some corn flour. If you use the last roll of toilet paper, then go buy some more toilet paper. Today we hear an if-then statement in the second reading, which I think is one of the most important statements in the entire Bible. So I want to take a deep dive into it with you today. It comes from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, of the New Testament, St. Paul's letters make up the bulk of the New Testament. And of all Paul's letters, it is Romans which is considered to be the most mature of all of Paul's thoughts. And so it's such an important letter that the church gives it to us in the second reading at Mass for 15 consecutive weeks. You might not notice it because we usually pay more attention to the Gospel, but we're reading it for the last few weeks and we're going to be for the next 10 weeks as well. And then of all the time we spend reading this very important book, which has 16 chapters, just one chapter, chapter 8, we are reading for 5 consecutive weeks. It's so dense, it's so important that we read it for several weeks and just take a few verses at a time. And today we hear Romans 8, verse 11, which goes like this. If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, then he who raised Jesus from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies as well. It's a really important statement. I'll put it in the description below. But let's have a look at that statement, what it means. To start with, there's some assumptions there, which we probably take for granted. Paul says, the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead. The fact that Jesus was raised from the dead is something that St. Paul takes as absolute fact. Now that seems obvious to us today, but in 55 or 60 AD when Paul wrote this, it was still a new idea that only people were coming to gradually hear about really through Paul's own preaching. The idea that anyone could come back from the dead. Paul had not been in Jerusalem in 30 AD when Jesus was crucified. Paul didn't see Jesus laid in the tomb. Paul didn't see the empty tomb. But what Paul did have was an experience of the risen Jesus appearing to him so concretely that Paul would then go on to repeat many times, I have seen the Lord. And by having seen the Lord and being commissioned by him, Paul counted himself as being an apostle. So that's the first really important statement that Paul makes, that the Lord is risen from the dead. Paul then also says, the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead. Now, who raised Jesus from the dead? It's actually not Jesus himself. Jesus is, in the Gospels, let me go back to this. In the Gospels, we have the narration of the events around Jesus' death and resurrection. We hear the events of Jesus' passion and crucifixion. We hear that Jesus is killed. We hear that Jesus is laid in the tomb. And then we hear that Jesus is alive again and showing himself to his apostles and other disciples. But we don't really get anything about how this happened. It's Paul who explains it and says that it is God the Father, who raised Jesus from the dead. So the him in this statement is not Jesus himself. Jesus could not bring himself back. Despite him being the Son of God, when Jesus was dead, he was as unable to bring himself back to life as you or I would be. Jesus was completely dead, and so he relied on the Father to be the one who was able to raise him, to resurrect him from death. Really important statement embedded in that. So St. Paul's first half, the if part of this statement is, if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you. So that's Paul saying that the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead is in you. The then part, the conclusion of this statement is, then he who raised Jesus from the dead, again God, then God will give life to your mortal bodies too by the power of his Spirit at work in you. And what Paul's doing here that makes this so incredibly important is that Paul is connecting the historical event of Jesus' resurrection from the dead in 30 or so AD with the present and ongoing experience of us being filled with the Holy Spirit, of us being transformed by God's power. Again, that might seem kind of obvious to us today, but it wasn't in 55 AD. This was new information. This was brand new teaching from Paul and the other apostles to say that the death and resurrection of Jesus matters so much, because we are able to participate in that death and resurrection. That God, the power which God has to raise Jesus from dead, this incredible power, God has to work in us as well. That we are able to be filled with the same Spirit, the Holy Spirit as we name it. That we are able to be filled with the Holy Spirit, we are able to be transformed by the Spirit. When Paul says he would give life to your mortal bodies too, he actually means two things, which Paul often kind of describes in great detail in his letters. The first is that after our own death, that we have a chance to be resurrected with Christ. That's basically us going to heaven because of what Jesus has done for us and because of what God has done in and through Jesus. But we don't have to wait till we die. The Spirit of God can give life to us, to our mortal bodies here and now. The Spirit is at work in us, transforming us, healing us, forgiving us. Paul uses words justifying us or making us righteous. That is, transforming how we stand in relationship to the God of the universe here and now. The Spirit who comes to dwell in us gives us gifts, gives us charisms, works things in us that we would never have thought we could have done on our own. Indeed, we could not do on our own. The incredible difference that God makes in us is what Paul is describing here. So Paul is joining two incredibly important concepts in one very powerful if-then statement. If the Spirit of Him, that is God, who raised Jesus from the dead, is living in you, which Paul takes for granted that is living in us, then He who raised Jesus from the dead, that is God, then God will give life to your mortal bodies too. And this statement is as true for us today as it was in 55-60 AD when Paul wrote this down. The power of God to resurrect Jesus nearly 2,000 years ago is at work in us. So let's open ourselves to that power at work in us, because we all have needs. None of us are perfect. None of us are where we want to be yet. So if we open ourselves to the power of God to work in us, then God will indeed do great things. And as we read on throughout the book of Romans in the coming weeks, let's listen out for the other incredible things that God does in and through us.